Police pull over a black woman, then realize she's their new chief. Ava Johnson, a strong-willed, determined African-American woman, has spent years working her way up in a law enforcement career that often seemed to favor others over her. Despite the systemic barriers in her path, she has emerged victorious, landing the role of chief of police in a small, conservative town in the Midwest, Cedar View. This achievement was not only a personal victory for Ava but a triumph for the community, as it promised change in an environment that was often seen as resistant to diversity and inclusivity. Ava Johnson sat behind the wheel of her car, feeling the weight of the morning sun as it began to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet town of Cedar View. The town she had fought so hard to lead. The town that had always been a battleground for progress. Today marked the first day of her new role as chief of police. But it wasn't just about the title. It was about changing the narrative, rewriting the history of this department, and showing the community that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel as she passed familiar streets on her way to the station. Despite the excitement of the day, there was a gnawing unease in her stomach. She had fought too hard to get here, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a mountain to climb. Cedar View was a town known for its deep conservatism, where tradition ran deeper than any river, and its police department wasn't exactly progressive. In the years leading up to this day, Ava had read the reports of biased practices within the force, heard stories of racially charged interactions between police officers and the residents they were supposed to protect. And she had watched quietly as the system, one that often seemed to be built against people like her, continued its course. She had been passed over for promotions, faced skepticism from colleagues who doubted her abilities. But today was different. Today, Ava Johnson was in control. As she neared the traffic light, she instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror. A flash of red and blue lights blinked behind her, and her heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of moment that no one ever expects on their first day at work, the kind of moment that seemed almost too ironic to be true. She knew what this was. The town's conservative police force had always been slow to embrace her. And now, it seemed, they were testing her resolve before she even stepped foot in her new office. Ava pulled over to the side of the road, her breath steady but her pulse quickening. The sound of her tires crunching on the grass was a stark contrast to the heavy silence in the air. She knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't a random traffic stop. No, this was an intimidation tactic. She could feel it in her bones. Two officers approached the vehicle, both white, both seemingly ready to assert their authority. The first officer, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, walked toward her with a deliberate stride. There was a calmness to his movements, but Ava could see the suspicion in his eyes as he scanned her car. His younger partner, a man in his mid-20s, was a step behind, his face tight with an unspoken judgment. Ava's hands remained steady on the wheel as she lowered the window. The senior officer leaned in slightly, his gaze focused on the documents she had handed over. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat and carrying that all too familiar air of authority that Ava had encountered countless times before. He was already sizing her up, already making assumptions based on her appearance. Ava's pulse didn't spike. She had learned long ago that in moments like this, it was better to stay calm. She reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the required documents without a word. Her silence, however, didn't go unnoticed. The younger officer, eager to assert himself, spoke up. "What brings you out here? This area isn't exactly safe. You know." The words stung, but Ava didn't let them show. She had heard them all before, those casual, loaded comments that suggested she didn't belong in places like this. But she remained composed, her voice steady. "I'm on my way to work," she replied, meeting the young officer's gaze without flinching. The senior officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but the younger one wasn't done. Where exactly would that be? His tone was laced with suspicion, and Ava could see the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the first time she had been doubted. It wouldn't be the last. Ava paused for a moment, knowing full well that revealing her position would only escalate the tension. She had already fought to get here, to prove herself, and she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of reacting. "You'll find out soon enough," she said calmly, keeping her voice even. Her eyes locked onto the younger officer's, making sure he understood that she wasn't intimidated. The senior officer, sensing that things were about to spiral, interjected, "Let's not make this difficult. Mom, we can take this further if we need to." His words were a veiled threat, but Ava could hear the subtle crack in his voice. The power dynamic had shifted, but they didn't know it yet. Ava's patience was wearing thin. She had endured this kind of treatment far too many times in her life. Disrespect, assumptions, bias based on nothing but her skin color. She wasn't about to let these officers dictate the course of her first day on the job. Her voice was firm when she spoke again. "That won't be necessary," she said, her eyes never leaving theirs. "I'm Chief Ava Johnson, and I suggest you rethink how you're handling this situation." For a brief moment, neither officer spoke. Then, the senior officer's face drained of color. "You're the chief?" he stammered, disbelief hanging in his voice. Ava nodded, unwavering. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of years of hard work. "And I'd like to know why I was stopped and why I'm being questioned like this." The younger officer's smirk had vanished, replaced by shock. He fumbled for an explanation, but the damage had already been done. Ava had turned the tables. The power dynamic was no longer in their favor. The senior officer cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. "There must have been some kind of misunderstanding," he said weakly, trying to salvage the situation. Ava shook her head. "No," she said, her tone sharp. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is exactly the problem. You stop people like me without cause, make assumptions, and try to flex your authority because you think you can get away with it." For a moment, there was only silence as the officers processed her words. The younger one looked away, visibly shaken. The senior officer said nothing, his eyes avoiding hers. Ava felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been unjustly stopped, questioned, and harassed because they didn't fit someone's narrow idea of who belonged in certain spaces. With a final look, Ava got out of her car. She stood tall, her presence commanding. "You'll be reporting to me personally for the next few weeks," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "I'll be reviewing every traffic stop you make, and I suggest you think long and hard about how you handle yourselves from now on." The senior officer nodded, clearly rattled. "We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. It won't happen again." Ava knew his words were empty. She wasn't naive enough to believe they would change overnight. But this encounter had made one thing clear: she was exactly where she needed to be. As she walked back to her car, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had won this round, but she knew there were many more battles ahead, and Ava Johnson was ready for every single one of them. Ava Johnson stood in the doorway of the police department's briefing room, watching as her officers trickled in one by one. The room was filled with the hum of low conversations, murmurs that hushed the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't unusual for the officers to go quiet when the new chief entered. But today, there was something different. It was more than just respect for the new boss. Today, it was tension, palpable in the air, thick enough to slice with a knife. She had spent most of her life preparing for this moment. But nothing could have fully prepared her for the weight of the responsibility she now carried. The department she was about to lead had been marred by years of controversy. Cedar View was a town where deep-seated conservative values clashed with the changing tides of a more diverse and inclusive society. It was a place where the police had historically treated some of its residents like outsiders, where racial biases had long been overlooked or even quietly accepted. Ava had fought for this position, but she knew that the real work, the real battle, was just beginning. Not just with the people she'd have to serve, but with those she'd have to lead. The thought of trying to reform the very institution that had long been complicit in these practices made her stomach churn. As the last officer, a tall man with a buzz cut named Officer Harris, took his seat, Ava stepped up to the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The officer's eyes followed her. Some with uncertainty, others with something darker, resentment, perhaps. But Ava kept her gaze steady, her posture unwavering. She was in charge now. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice strong and confident, though the knot in her stomach threatened to betray her calm demeanor. "I trust everyone had a productive night. I'm sure many of you have heard about the incident this morning. Let me make one thing very clear. What happened out there will not be tolerated in this department." She paused, letting the words sink in. She could see the discomfort ripple across the room. Some officers shifted in their seats, while others met her gaze directly, no longer hiding the disdain they felt. She wasn't blind to the undercurrents of discontent. They had made it clear during her appointment that they didn't think a woman like her, especially a woman of color, should be in charge. Now, they were here to see if she could back up the promise of change she had made during her interview. Ava took a breath, knowing that this was the moment. This was the test. The room was heavy with expectation. "I don't need to tell you why what happened this morning was wrong," Ava continued, her eyes scanning the room. "We all know the history. We all know the culture. And for too long, this department has ignored the very people it's supposed to protect. That ends today." A low murmur spread through the room. But she didn't back down. She didn't need to. She was chief now, and it was her job to drive the point home, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Effective immediately, she went on, her voice gaining strength. "There will be no more assumptions. No more targeting individuals based on their appearance. You will treat everyone in Cedar View with respect, no matter their race, gender, or background. There will be zero tolerance for bias. If you can't follow that, then you don't belong here." At her words, a few officers bristled, but Ava noticed that a few were nodding, some even looking relieved. She was making waves, and while it would take time to win their full trust, Ava knew that she was already starting to shift the atmosphere in the room. The old guard was resistant, but the new blood, the younger officers, were more open to the idea of real change. Ava addressed him again, softer now but no less firm. "This is your chance to prove that you are the kind of officers who serve with integrity, who protect and serve every citizen, not just those you deem worthy of your protection. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for effort, and I'm asking for accountability." As she spoke, her eyes settled on Officer Harris, the one who had been among the most vocal in expressing his displeasure about her appointment. He was sitting back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ava had always known that there would be resistance, and Harris was the face of it. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Ava didn't back away. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice steady, "you've made your feelings about my appointment very clear. But I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to do what's right. And if you think you can undermine that, I will have no choice but to take action." Harris didn't flinch, but Ava could see the shift in his posture. He was angry, but there was something else too: fear. He knew the clock was ticking. It was no longer about whether he liked her. It was about whether he could adapt to the changes she was bringing. "I understand, Chief," he muttered, though it was clear that he wasn't thrilled with the situation. Ava nodded, turning away from him to address the entire room. "In the coming weeks, we will be conducting audits of all traffic stops. And I will personally be reviewing body cam footage. If there's any indication of bias or misconduct, I will deal with it swiftly and decisively." She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. And for a brief moment, Ava thought she might lose them all. But then, something shifted. One officer, Officer Green, a quiet but diligent officer who had always kept his head down, spoke up. "Chief," he said cautiously, his voice cutting through the tension, "I just want you to know, I'm with you. I'm ready for this. We can make things better. If we all just stick together." Ava met his eyes, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Green wasn't the only one who felt this way. She knew, the others were just waiting for someone to lead the way. "Thank you, Officer Green," Ava said, her voice softer now. "But this won't be easy. There will be resistance. There will be setbacks. And there will be days when we question whether it's worth it. But I promise you this, I'm not backing down. And I hope, for the sake of this community, you won't either." The rest of the meeting passed in a haze of logistics, updates, and briefings. But Ava knew the real battle had just begun. She could feel the weight of her decisions already pressing on her shoulders. Some of her officers were on board, but others, they would fight her every step of the way. As the meeting adjourned, Ava walked to her office, the door clicking shut behind her. She stood there for a moment, staring at the empty desk, the chair behind it now hers for the first time. She knew the hardest part was yet to come, but she was ready. Ava Johnson wasn't just chief of police. She was a symbol of change. And no one, not even those who resented her, could deny the significance of that. The days since Ava Johnson had become chief of police in Cedar View had been a blur. Every moment felt like a test. Every decision weighed against a mountain of expectations. She had spent her first week in office meeting with community leaders, reviewing internal reports, and overseeing department policies, trying, and sometimes failing, to balance the expectations of the town with the promise of change. It wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore. It was about redefining it. The incident with the two officers had sent shockwaves through the department. It was a wake-up call, both for the officers involved and for the rest of the force. Some had silently accepted the reality of the shift in power, but others were struggling with the idea of a woman, and a black woman at that, leading them. Ava had known the first few weeks would be a struggle, but she hadn't anticipated just how deep the resistance ran. It was late afternoon when she received a call that would set the tone for the weeks to come. Her secretary informed her that a group of concerned citizens from the town was waiting to speak with her. Cedar View, a town not known for being particularly vocal or progressive, had suddenly found its voice. Ava's appointment as chief of police had sparked a wave of both excitement and fear in the community. And it was clear that her leadership was not sitting well with everyone. As she walked down the hall toward the community room, Ava's thoughts raced. She had heard the rumors, whispers of discontent, murmurs of fear that a woman of color leading the police department was a mistake. Cedar View had long been a town of traditions. And traditions didn't change overnight. She had expected some pushback. But the quiet resentment in the air was beginning to feel suffocating. When Ava entered the room, she was greeted with cold stares. A group of 5 people sat at the table, mostly older white residents, their expressions a mix of skepticism and hostility. At the head of the table sat Richard Caldwell, a prominent businessman in Cedar View and a longtime advocate for conservative values. Ava knew him well. He was one of the loudest voices opposing her appointment. And she could already see the storm clouds gathering in his eyes. "Chief Johnson," Caldwell began, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of tension, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. But I think it's important we address some concerns the community has about your leadership." Ava's posture was unwavering as she took a seat at the opposite end of the table. "I'm happy to listen, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Please, go ahead." Caldwell exchanged a quick glance with the others before speaking again, this time with a touch more force. "The people of Cedar View are concerned about the direction this town is headed. The police department has been one of the few institutions in this town that has upheld the values we hold dear, values of law and order, of fairness. But now, with you in charge, we fear those values are being compromised." Ava felt a tightness in her chest. She had heard variations of this argument before, but hearing it from someone like Caldwell, the kind of person who had always been in control, struck a nerve. This wasn't just about her leadership. This was about her identity. Her very presence shaking the foundation of their beliefs. "Respectfully, Mr. Caldwell," Ava said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions building inside her. "I'm not here to tear down Cedar View's values. But those values can't ignore the realities of systemic inequality. The law must protect everyone equally, not just those who fit a certain mold." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Ava wondered if she had gone too far. Caldwell's jaw tightened, and she could see the irritation in his eyes. "Systemic inequality," he scoffed. "We've had no such issues here. Cedar View is a law-abiding town. There's no need for these so-called reforms. We don't need someone like you coming in here and upsetting everything." The temperature in the room dropped. Ava could feel the hostility rising. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a battle, one that Ava wasn't sure she was winning. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice soft but cutting, "I didn't come here to upset things. I came here to make sure that every resident of Cedar View feels safe, no matter their race or background. If that's upsetting to you, then I suggest you take a hard look at what Cedar View truly stands for." The tension in the room was palpable. The other members of the group shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to support Caldwell or acknowledge Ava's points. But Caldwell wasn't backing down. "This is the problem," he spat, his voice rising. "You come in here, thinking you can change everything with a few lofty ideals. You think you can just waltz into this town and tell us what we need. Well, you're wrong." Ava stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell into an even deeper silence as she towered over the table, her gaze locking with Caldwell's. "I don't need your permission to make this department and this town better," she said, her voice firm. "I will do what's necessary to protect everyone in Cedar View. If that's a problem for you, then we'll have a problem." For a moment, there was no movement. Ava could hear her heartbeat in her ears. Then, Caldwell's face reddened, but he said nothing more. He wasn't ready to give up the fight just yet. but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Ava knew this wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. The meeting ended without any resolution, but as Ava left the room, she could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't naive. She knew she had made enemies, and she knew that this battle would be a long one. But she had made her point. Later that evening, Ava sat at her desk, reviewing the footage of the office's body cam from the day she had been stopped on her way into town. The video was uncomfortable to watch. It wasn't just about the office's behavior, it was about what that moment represented. It was a clear example of the kind of bias she was trying to root out. Not just in her offices, but in the town as a whole. As she leaned back in her chair, the door to her office opened softly. Officer Green stepped inside, his expression serious but respectful. "Chief," he said quietly, "I just wanted to check in on you. I know today was a lot." Ava gave him a small, appreciative smile. "It's been a long day, Officer Green, but I'm used to it." Green paused for a moment before speaking again. "You're doing the right thing, Chief. I know it's hard, but the community needs you. This department needs you." Ava looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time that day, she felt a little lighter. "Thank you, Green," she said, her voice softening. "That means more than you know." As Green left, Ava sat in the quiet of her office, staring at the screen in front of her. There was no going back now. The storm was coming, but Ava Johnson was ready to face it head-on. Cedar View was about to change, whether its residents liked it or not, and she was the one who would lead him through it. As we reflect on Ava Johnson's journey in Cedar View, there's more than just a story of conflict and change. It's a story that speaks to all of us about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Ava didn't just take on a role, she took on a challenge that many would shy away from. But in her determination to create a fairer world for everyone, she shows us something valuable. First and foremost, it's about resilience. Life isn't always going to hand us the easy road. Ava's journey was filled with obstacles, doubts, and opposition, but through every setback, she didn't falter. She pushed forward with the kind of quiet strength that we all can learn from. Whether it's in the workplace, in our personal lives, or in the face of a bigger societal change, resilience is key. When you face the tough times, remember, perseverance doesn't mean you never struggle. It means you keep going, no matter how hard it gets. Secondly, it's about confronting uncomfortable truths. Ava's story reminds us that sometimes change requires us to have difficult conversations. It's never easy to challenge the status quo, especially when it's been ingrained for so long. But just like Ava did with the officers in her department or the community members who questioned her leadership, we too must be brave enough to confront the biases and systems that need reform. Change often begins with a single voice. It begins with you, speaking up for what's right, even if it's not popular. Another lesson Ava teaches us is the importance of empathy and understanding. Throughout her story, Ava didn't just demand respect, she earned it by demonstrating empathy, by understanding the struggles of others, and by doing everything she could to create an environment where everyone felt safe and valued. In our own lives, we can carry this forward by practicing empathy in our interactions, acknowledging others' challenges, and being open to learning from each other. Finally, Ava shows us the power of leadership. True leadership isn't about holding power over others. It's about empowering those around you. Ava didn't step into her role to wield power, she stepped in to make a difference. In any position of leadership, whether in the workplace, at home, or within our communities, the real strength comes from lifting others up. guiding them through change, and being unafraid to stand firm in our values. At the end of the day, Ava Johnson's story is a reminder that we all have a role to play in making our world a better place. It's not always easy, and it's rarely clear-cut. But when we approach life with integrity, courage, and compassion, we can make a difference. So, let's take this story with us, not just as an inspiration, but as a call to action. Whether it's standing up for what we believe in, supporting those around us, or being the change we want to see in the world, we all have the power to make our communities, and ourselves, better. Remember, change is hard, but it is always possible. This conclusion aims to wrap up the lessons from the story while making them accessible, relevant, and engaging for an audience. It encourages introspection and action in a way that resonates with common American values such as resilience, empathy, and leadership. Let me know if you'd like to adjust anything further.